Hi, I'm Stephen Threadgold, the coordinator of Soccer 1010, and in this lecture I'll be introducing you to what sociology is. Basically, introducing you to the very concept and discipline of sociology, and I'll be doing this by cutting up this lecture into four parts. Firstly, I'll be doing a broad definition of what sociology is and getting you to understand a little bit about the way we want you to think in this course and the orientation towards things. In part two, I'll go through some specific sociological themes such as class and gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity and power. In part three, I'll be looking at the notion of the sociological imagination, which is something we hope that you can develop throughout this course. And in part four, I'll be talking about the concept of socialization and different ways of understanding that process. So let's start with part one. What is sociology? So I suppose one of the things we want you to develop in this course is a kind of critical orientation towards the everyday, towards common sense, towards things that we kind of take for granted. Sociology wants us to think about the way things are, who benefits, and how could things be better. So a nice kind of little aphorism that's increasingly used to think about that is this idea of making the normal look strange. I want you to think about that very idea of what it means to be normal, who that excludes, and why. And more generally, we can think about the ways that some things that seemed quite normal really could be considered really strange or, even violent or unequal or immoral. So I think some of the, the cartoons and photos and memes and stuff that I've got up over the next couple of pages can be a way of starting to think about and unpacking some of those things. So firstly, in terms of gender relations, there's a photo there of Elise Perry and David Warner at the Allan Border Medal a few years ago. You can see the actual photo below where Elise Perry's quite taller, much bit taller than David Warner. Why would the Australian newspaper feel the need to make the man taller when they represent him on the front page? What's going on there? Whose interests is being represented? Is this a kind of indication of what we'll later in the course look at as understandings of patriarchy? The same a few years ago when the new Ghostbusters comes out, when it's a female version of it, there's all kinds of, weird sexist complaints about it. But really, why weren't people complaining about the idea that, female Ghostbusters would probably make about 80% of what the male Ghostbusters were? Again, representative of real inequalities that are happening in day-to-day society. The guy there holding the cardboard sign, we can think about, we'll be thinking about things like how upward credentialising of the workplace, the increasing precarious labour market and casualisation of the labour market means that people with all kinds of qualification and educations these days are kind of living an economic life that a couple of generations ago may have looked like they were in poverty. This is particularly the case with creative industries kind of things, the artistic world. More and more today we need more and more qualifications to do jobs in the past that didn't need as many. People are studying for longer, and this is having all kinds of effects on young people's transitions from being a child to adulthood. We'll look at that in some detail later in the course as well. Another way of making the normal look strange is to think about our kind of criminal justice system, the law, and all those kind of things. You can see here that there's a couple of snippets of newspaper articles there where a mortgage CIO is sentenced to like 40 months jail for $3 billion. Scheme of $3 billion fraud, which would have literally affected thousands of people's lives. 40-month sentence, probably got out in less than 12 months on parole or whatever. Yet a homeless man gets jailed for 15 years for stealing $100. Next day, he actually voluntarily surrendered to the police and still got 15 years jail. So, in terms of making the normal look strange here, let's think a little bit about who benefits from our criminal justice system, from the law, who's being protected by these things. In relation, in the cartoon over there, Dad, I'm considering a career in organised crime, government or private sector. Now think about all what's going on at the moment with various things like pork barrelling, sports frauds, various forms of governmental corruption. Who's actually doing the immoral behaviour here, and why isn't that seen as criminal, for instance? Some more examples. We can think about our institutions from a sociological perspective. what do our institutions do? What kind of people do they produce? And so from some critical perspectives, we can make comparisons, for instance, between prisons and schools. That if you break down the actual practices that are encouraged in there and the kind of rules and regulations of them, they can be quite similar in many ways. They discipline us and try and, I suppose, enforce us to be particular kinds of people. And again, who benefits from that kind of relation? We'll be doing a whole week in the course on consumption. So we can think there with the cartoon about Christmas, maybe, rather than kind of thinking about the, cartoonish Santa Claus there, we can think about how all our plastic products are made, the pollution that produces, the terrible working conditions of those things, and then how those things are shipped all around the world, which, again, creates all kinds of pollution. But in terms of our individual consumption practices, it's really difficult to consume ethically. And as the other cartoon there says, if I drink 14,000 more cups of free trade coffee, you might cancel out the conditions and the pollution that's involved in one iPhone or something like that. So again, we'll be thinking critically about our everyday practices. We'll be making the normal practices of, say, buying a cup of coffee look a little bit more strange by unpacking some of the processes that come to put that coffee cup in your hand. We'll be doing a week later in the course on digital world. So, we can think a little bit about notions of friendship and notions of everyday contact and sociality that social media has changed in many ways. So, the idea of friendship, you can have thousands of friends on Facebook, but, maybe not many of them will be coming to your funeral. Think a little bit about power here, about the legal system. And I think that's a really amazing photo there when you think about all the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening, particularly last year. When something's reported as a riot, who's the people that are rioting? Probably the people that are dressed as prepared to riot are the ones that are causing the violence. And as social medias have been increasingly useful for showing, many instances of violence at those protests are actually instigated by the police. So again, whose interests are being protected by those social relations? Lastly, even the very concept of time is something that we can kind of sociologically analyse and make the normal look strange. I suppose generally we just think of time as this thing unfolding in a linear kind of trajectory, but our concepts of time and the way time makes us feel has changed a lot over centuries. Back when societies were organised around more feudal times, time was experienced much more episodically, particularly in relation to work. So people would work intensely for weeks or months, and then there'd be long periods where there wasn't much to do. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we started to think about what we now kind of call clock time or factory time, where there's a 5-day work week and a weekend. People clock into work at a certain time and leave at a certain time in the afternoon or night or whatever. So the very organisation of time in that sense changes, and this changes the way that we live our lives. On a more broader scale, you can think of time across eons and civilizations and the ways societies develop. So, that again, the cartoon there, people leaving after hours, people exercising in the morning, have very different concepts of what's going on at that particular point in the day. So these are just some small examples to help us think about making the normal look strange, turning a critical eye on the everyday, on the normal, on common sense, on the things we take for granted. So, to get to a more kind of official definition, I'm just kind of setting up, I suppose, a vibe there of the way we're going to be thinking in this course. But what is sociology? Well, it does mean different things to different people. You'll find that any large disciplines, sociology, psych, economics, all these different kind of large knowledge-based, research-based disciplines mean different things to different people, and people within those disciplines are often debating about what they should be doing. But generally, traditionally, it's a combination of research, theory, and criticism. Importantly, sociology and its findings and the things it has to say about the world and the theories and concepts it produces rely on what we call empirical research. And that's where sociologists go out into the world and do surveys, focus groups, interviews. They might do things like participant observation, where they take part in the thing that they're researching, or ethnographies where they're kind of observing over a long period of time the thing they're researching. Increasingly today we do participatory kinds of research where the people that we're researching with are taking part in the projects, and we're using technologies more and more as well, and photorealism and these kind of things. There's two kinds of empirical research: broadly quantitative, which is more statistical based, and qualitative, which is more interview observational stuff. And broadly, what sociology tries to do is to uncover, understand social systems, and how they relate to individuals, how they affect individuals' lives, and how they kind of also affect groups of similar people and their kind of experience of life and their inequalities and their opportunities. So sociology is particularly interested in inequalities and power, and how kind of over long periods of time those kind of structures seem to stay the same, and the same kind of people over time benefit from them. But it's also really interested in social changes as well, because of course what sociology tends to show is that things stay the same and change all at once. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. Things change and stay the same, and that'll be a kind of thing that comes up throughout the course. One of the kind of relations we think of, or we use to think of this, is the idea of agency versus structure. So I'll get to that later on. But very broadly, agency is the idea of that as an individual, you have a certain amount of freedom or power to put your choices into practice, to be able to do what you want to do. If you have more freedom and more power to be able to do that, you have more agency. If you have less ability to be able to live the life you want to live and live it free of marginalisation and discrimination, you have less agency. And structures are the kind of the things in the world that I suppose in some ways limit agency. They're the things like laws and schools and stuff, and politics and stuff like that put out the rules in the world. Science and psychology and even sociology are part of those structures. But structures are also not necessarily always limiting. They actually provide us with elements of agency as well, in the sense that, say for instance, that it's illegal to kill other people, actually provides individuals mostly a freedom to be not be murdered on a day-to-day basis. So structures are both restricting and also offer affordances for us to live a more free life. So it's not always necessarily seen as a negative, deterministic kind of thing. So that agency versus structure, the tension between those things, is something we'll be looking at in the course. It's important to kind of point out that really looking at agency and structure is a little bit simplistic in terms of the way that we live. Things are much more complex than that kind of dichotomy, but it's, I suppose, a simple way to start thinking about those broad social relationships. So just in comparison to other kind of social sciences, I suppose, we tend in sociology to focus kind of groups of people that are alike, unlike psych, which is mostly focuses on individual, but also does a lot of group stuff as well. Unlike philosophy or journalism, sociology does research, so we have empirical data to use to make our conclusions and findings and concepts and theories. As I've spoke about already, we're kind of looking at the ideas of common sense, how powerful relations that benefit some people over others have become legitimated, tries to make the normal look strange, and importantly, shows how all kinds of really disparate things interrelate. So I'll get into that in the second parts of the lecture. So we can see here, some of the kind of dictionary type definitions. I won't bother reading those out. But I will say that I've been teaching sociology now for about 15 years, and many students find it really empowering. They can relate it to themselves, and we'll be asking you to do that throughout this course, to think about your own life and how the various concepts and things we're going to talk about have affected you or not. And for myself, I found it also really life-changing. Particularly the book Why Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs by Paul Willis. When I started studying sociology in 1999, really opened my eyes to my own kind of school life and the trajectory of me and my other male friends, and how quite often they kind of replicated what their fathers were doing, and really kind of highlighted a lot of stuff that was going on in my school. And it can be a really kind of life-changing thing, and can make people like understand some of the things that have gone in their own life. But importantly, we hope that sociology opens you up to be more sensitive and tolerant of other people's positions and lives and, I suppose, struggles. So there's kind of two things that we're hoping happens in this course: that you can understand your own life and those around you better, but probably more importantly, get a better understanding of people that are unlike you, and to maybe think more empathetically and tolerantly and sensitively about other people's lives, and come to kind of understand them better. Sociology tends to think of itself as a science. That is, we go out and get data and then we analyse it. And it certainly is that in many ways. But in the last couple of decades, we've come to understand sociology as, not being completely, apolitical or completely objective. And in fact, sociology itself has shone a critical light on science itself, like, physics, chemistry, all those kind of things, as also not being completely objective. Why is that? Well, it's performed by humans. We go into these spaces to do our work, whether it's going out and doing an interview or whether it's, doing an experiment in a test tube, and we bring our own experiences to it, we bring our own biases to it, we make our own choices around that. So therefore, there's a politics about the way those things work. And that is the case with science as well, like in terms of the way things get funded, what are the things that get focused upon and prioritised and all that kind of thing. So in kind of reaction to this kind of realisation, I suppose, Pierre Bourdieu, who will come up in the course quite a bit, started to talk about sociology as what he called a martial art. Sociology there becomes a way of kind of defending the defenceless, always questioning the works of power and attempting to make life for everyone, better for everyone. So this knowledge, he argues, shouldn't be used to kind of attack people. It's more about defence, which is what most good martial arts are meant to be about. So again, I want you to think about this. This is the idea of reflexivity, that sociologists need to be reflexive about their own place in the world, the way their own biases inflect the choices when they do research and the conclusions that they make. And that should, I suppose, encourage us to kind of render some of those inadequacies and biases out of the research when we're writing it up. Overall, for Bourdieu and many other sociologists, sociology's role is to discover the hidden, symbolic, taken for granted assumptions that underpin power relations that I've spoken a little bit about already. So by the end of the course, we hope that you're developing sociological gaze, a kind of particular way of questioning the world, being in the world, critically engaging with things, looking for the links between individuals and social structures, groups and inequalities, and thinking about this, how it affects us across the ways that we kind of live, work and play. So I've already said a little bit about the way that sociology has affected my life. It certainly was a huge kind of influence on the way that I've lived ever since. It is something that I think sometimes you need to turn off. It's sometimes hard to be in all social situations when you're sociologizing everything. But we hope by the end of the course that you develop this kind of critical sociological imagination, which is what I'll talk about in the third video. But the second video, I'll kind of start unpacking some of the key sociological concepts. So to conclude, I want us to think what the sociological gaze, how do all these kind of disparate things interrelate? So we want you to think about how you can see the general in the particular, how, people share all kinds of experiences, and what does this mean? And how do we then relate to those people when they're different to us or the same? And how do we categorize those people and judge them? Seeing the strange in the familiar, I've kind of spoken about that already, and I'll talk about some aspects of that more when I start talking about culture and the kind of different norms that cultures produce for us. Seeing society and everyday choices, how our personal decisions are always shaped by the societal conditions that we're in. No one can really make choices free from outside influences. And also seeing society in marginality and crisis. So, things like the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 kind of allows us to see how globalization means that we're all affected by these large-scale things now. That like something that happens in Russia breaks the borders and affects rivers and streams in Wales, thousands of miles away. Things like Black Lives Matter movements show that racial relations in America are been kind of taken on here by sometimes under the name of BLM, but also how the situation here is really, really different in many ways, and the history of our race relations in Australia are quite different. And we'll again do a whole week on that in terms of Indigenous perspectives later in the course. Things like economic crises, like in 2008, when there's a huge meltdown of the economic system. Again, who benefits from that? There's only a few billionaires or whatever go to jail, and really, hundreds of thousands of people lose their jobs and houses, and that kind of crisis reveals those kind of deep inequalities of the world. So these are the kind of things we'll be looking at in some detail, or I suppose encouraging you to have an orientation towards these things throughout the course.